Hello everyone, and welcome to our panel on inequalities in care, global, local and transnational dynamics in an age of migration. We're going to focus on migration policies and separated families today. We have 5 speakers, and I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Matt Withers. He's going to talk about development without care, familial separation and care depletion within Australia's Pacific Labour Scheme. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Kelly. So today, my name is Matt Withers. I'm a research fellow at Macquarie University, and today I'm going to be talking about a paper entitled Development Without Care, which is written with my co-author Elizabeth Hill from the University of Sydney. And what we've tried to do in this paper is to draw links between temporary labour migration schemes, transnational care practices, and how these relate to sustainable development outcomes. This is all against the backdrop of Australia's Pacific Labour Scheme, which is a new temporary labour migration program in Australia, which I conducted research into in 2019 and 2020. Next slide, please. I'm briefly going to discuss temporary labour migration schemes to give some understanding of the parameters which might affect care practices within these programs and the PLS specifically. Before talking about what we're trying to do in terms of theorising transnational care practices and relating some of this to my initial research findings. Next slide, please. So some of the common features of these kinds of temporary labour migration programs are that they're typically demand-driven, involving migration into lower wage industries, often through employer-type visas, so that the labourer is bonded to a particular employer and cannot readily change during the course of migration. These contracts are often 2 to 3 years in duration, making them distinct from seasonal employment. They almost universally entail individual entry permits, so that there's no possibility for familial accompaniment. And they're explicitly circular in that they're designed to have no pathway to permanent residency. And there's an inbuilt expectation of repetition, so that migrant workers move between home and host country several times over multiple years, sometimes decades. The Pacific Labour Scheme is Australia's first multi-year guest worker scheme of this type. It was piloted in 2016 and commenced in proper in 2018. And it essentially involves Pacifica workers who have been recruited from 10 small Pacific Island countries to work in Australia's aged care and other low-wage sectors in rural and regional parts of the country for periods of 3 years. The program is framed explicitly as Australia's flagship development program for the Pacific region, which I think exposes an underlying assumption that this isn't just a labour supply agreement, but implicitly and axiomatically should produce development outcomes for those countries of origin. And that's really, next slide, please, where we start to sort of make an entry point into interrogating some of the assumptions that come behind that. The foremost of which is that the backdrop to these programs' proliferation is the growth of remittances globally. As you can see in this chart here, that remittances have eclipsed foreign direct investment, but also other forms of private capital flows and official development aid to become the largest inflow of capital for emerging economies globally. And this has underwritten the expansion of temporary labour migration programs with the assumption that they will axiomatically compel development outcomes. Next slide, please. We basically contend that this is a very narrow measure of the economy, and that these cost-benefit analyses which run behind migration programs like this tend to weigh the benefits of remittances in particular against the mobility costs such as recruitment fees, but also the counterfactual of foregone local employment without making sufficient consideration to the disruption of other forms of unpaid work such as unpaid care labour that is essential for the sustaining everyday life. As we all know, care is gendered, it's also invisible, and in this case it's treated as an implicitly infinite resource that can be commodified through temporary labour migration and displaced without a need for it to be substituted for. The point I want to impress here is that migration is not an individual pursuit, but it's a household strategy, and in that strategy it displaces productive and reproductive labour, whereas remittances only compensate for the former. Next slide, please. And if we draw upon some recent ILO statistics, we can see that particularly in the case of feminized migration, there can be a lot of reproductive labor to compensate for. Here we can see that in the Asia Pacific, women tend to perform 4 times the unpaid care work of their male counterparts. And when they migrate, that leaves a large vacuum of unpaid care work to be filled. Next slide, please. Theoretically, what we're trying to do then is to situate this problem at the intersection of 3 partially overlapping literatures, one on migration and development, another on migration and care, and a third literature on gender and development. And essentially, we're arguing that none of these sufficiently or comprehensively theorize what we term a migration care development nexus that links gendered asymmetries in unpaid care work with changes to household work and care patterns during periods of migration, and how these changes then interface with development outcomes and might affect development policy making for countries of origin. So our real contribution here is to situate care work as integral to the migration development debate and enter it into that cost-benefit analysis I mentioned earlier, but also to locate patterns of continuity and change in care practices which are maintained during migration. And here what we're proposing is that we can map the transnational disassembly and reassembly of care practices in a way which provides a bit more nuance than conceptualizing care transfers as being either unidirectional, as per the global care chains literature, or as reciprocal, perhaps, as care circulation contends in situations where care resources are not readily available. Next slide, please. To do so, we establish a taxonomy of care which separates proximate care activities, which we term care work, from care relationships, which we understand to be aspatial. So in terms of those proximate activities, we're talking about interpersonal caregiving, cooking and cleaning, and social and cultural and environmental reproduction, examples of those categories. And in terms of aspatial roles, we're talking more about emotional responsibilities and moral responsibilities that tend to continue whether or not varying parties are in close proximity or are transnationally separated during migration. Next slide, please. And what we've proposed is that here, during periods of transnational separation, we see a disassembly not just of labour and productive labour supply, but necessarily a form of care depletion where those proximate activities are obviously no longer able to take place, and therefore a form of care depletion occurs. However, we also note that there is some degree of reassembly that takes place through care circulation, where distance communication enables certain care relationships and roles to continue aspatially throughout the course of migration. However, what we're contending is that there's also room here for policy to design care ethical development policies that facilitate the redistribution of care resources back to countries of origin to compensate for care losses which occur during these periods of migration. Next slide, please. With relation to the Pacific Labour Scheme, and I'll skim through this quite quickly, I was addressing 2 central questions in my research. The first being, how do migrant households participate or participating in the PLS manage their care responsibilities, and familial and social relationships during periods of separation? And secondly, what are the implications for sustainable development among those specific items? To do so, we conducted interviews with the Kiribati workers and their family, and then did a second study, which was a longitudinal family study involving partners or couples from who are Kiribati, Ni Vanuatu, or from Tongan families. And this was across Australia, but also in Vanuatu. Next slide, please. The preliminary findings from the pilot interviews that I ran, or the interviews within the pilot scheme, indicated that Kiribati workers in Australia were experiencing a very high income differential from what they would earn back home, almost 20 times as much as they would earn in Kiribati, and had quipped that they earn more than their president does. However, it was evident that there were high rates of relationship breakdown amongst the workers I interviewed. Roughly 8 out of 36 couples who I spoke to had some form of relationship breakdown during the 2 years of their employment. They were also highly dependent on using video calls to maintain relationships back home, but also use these as a way of playing roles, and beyond that, witnessing milestones in family life. I spoke to one worker who witnessed or saw his child for the first time by way of a Facebook video, and others who were seeing key milestones such as their child walking or uttering their first words through that medium. But workers also used those forms of video communication to maintain active care roles in organising care for children, monitoring their well-being, but also issuing instructions to substitute caregivers. And beyond that, also engaged in what I term remission care by using material gifts as a substitute for care which they were unable to provide in person. Another key outcome of this was that most of these workers had little desire to return to Kiribati, and placed a lot of emphasis on repeatedly migrating to maintain the income they had, and therefore extending periods of family separation. Next slide, please. Just briefly, some findings from the longitudinal study which I conducted, which actually got interrupted and therefore wasn't very longitudinal. But from the families I did speak to at the outset of their migration, I spoke to two Li-Fang Liang couples who'd been recruited simultaneously so that both partners within the relationship could migrate to Australia together and work at the same time, and both of which had dependent children. However, one couple was very comfortable to leave their children in the care of relatives, and the others regarded this form of separation to be a deal breaker and withdrew from the program. Another woman who was a single mother was concerned to leave her children with parents who lived in the outer islands of Vanuatu, largely on the basis that she was concerned that the child would inherit outdated values that didn't reflect her own. And across the board, workers anticipated having relationship problems and suggested that there needed to be greater family participation in the pre-departure briefings that were part of the program. So there was a real plurality of household care arrangements and preferences which emerged from that. With regard to time, I might move along to the next slide, please. And just highlight that really what came out of the research was that the economic benefits of the PLS vary considerably by location, industry, and other contextual factors. And in some cases, the economic allure of the program was particularly high, as was the case in Kiribati. However, among all the participants I spoke to, care practices had been significantly disrupted during migration, resulting in forms of care depletion, but also relationship breakdown, with adverse consequences for the overall well-being of the household in the longer run. And what became quite clear is that sustainable and gender equitable development outcomes will require policy that can actively support and reassemble care practices transnationally. Next slide, please. So here, what was most sort of obvious was that guest worker schemes in general have a poor record of supporting women and their families, and without considering care, the PLS is likely to reproduce those outcomes which have already proven to be detrimental elsewhere. Family accompaniment, pathways to settlement, and couples placements are all policy parameters to reconsider in alignment with the preferences of households, and this speaks to that plurality of household care arrangements and preferences which I spoke to previously. However, there are also other adjustments which could be implemented within the program to support transnational family life more readily, involving the greater participation of families in pre-departure briefings to calibrate expectations about how to manage relationships at a distance, but also subsidisation of uneven travel costs and communication costs, which do vary very wildly across Australia, and particularly for workers in Western Australia. The prospect of returning home to meet their families was basically ruled untenable because of the cost of those flights. But I guess more ambitiously, we've both sort of focused on decent care policies as an alternative, which would involve Australian aid and government policy being directed towards direct investment in community care services within countries of origin to create publicly available forms of care resources which can be drawn upon by migrant families in lieu of care capacity that's been lost due to migration. And I think more generally, we also want to emphasise that there needs to be closer attention to skill transfers, processes of reintegration, and the likelihood of repeat migration within the programme, as iterative 3-year periods of separation are going to exacerbate existing problems related to transnational family separation. And next slide, please. I believe that is all. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Matt. That was really interesting. I'd like to now move straight on to our second presentation today from Li-Fang Liang. Her presentation is on doing transnational caregiving, Indonesian migrant living care workers and their left or stay behind aged parents. Over to you, Li-Fang.
Okay, thank you, Kelly, for the nice introduction. And so I'm Li-Fang from National Dong-Hwa University in Taiwan. And so the presentation for today is part of a larger project to explore how Indonesian migrant living care workers are doing care and doing family in the context of transnational labor migration. And for today, I will focus on the care exchange and care circulation between Indonesian migrant living care workers and their left or stay behind aged parents. Next, please. So Mai has worked as the migrant living care workers in Taiwan more than 10 years, and she decided to work overseas because she wants to provide a better life for her family. It referred to her age, her two kids. And so this the investigation of this study is anchored in the life experience of Indonesian migrant living care workers like Mai and their left or stay behind aged parents. Next, please. Based on their narratives, this research examined how migrant adult children and their aged parents are doing transnational care in the context of labor migration. So I have two research questions. First, how do migrant live-in care workers and their aged parents provide and receive care to or from each other with the limitations? And second, how do they collaborate with each other at distance to exchange care and maintain the relationships? Next, please. So here I will describe migrant care labor policy in Taiwan briefly to show how transnational caregiving and care exchange is shared by the institutional context. The Taiwan government opens the employment of migrant living care workers in 1992, although the government regard migrant workers as the temporary and supplementary labor. The number of migrant living care workers has increased quickly in the past decades. By the end of 2020, there are about 230,000 migrant living care workers in Taiwan, and the number doesn't include those workers working in institutional settings or work as domestic workers. And the large group is the Indonesian workers. They occupy more than 2/3 of migrant living care workers in Taiwan. And the migrant labor policy is based on guest worker schemes. The maximum work year for live-in migrant care workers is 40 years, and their freedom of movement is restricted. It's mandatory for them to live with their care recipients, and they don't have rights to family reunifications, and they are not entitled to the labor standard 8 in Taiwan. And so it means their rights and working condition is based on the negotiation between them and their employers. Next, please. So the research is situated in the literatures on transnational caregiving in the context of transnational family. First, it challenges the claim that caregiving requires physical proximity, but also highlights the importance of mental and emotional dimension. Second, this study also tried to challenge the linear. Sorry, it's my cat. This study also tried to challenge the linear relationship between caregivers and care recipients and the dichotomy between these two parties. And third, it point out the care involve multiple dimension, multiple generation, and multiple directions. Next, thanks. So I relied on interview and participant observation to collect the data and so far I interviewed 25 Indonesian live-in care workers in Taiwan. Most of them are from rural Java and their age from 29 to 47 years old. Among them, 16 are married, 8 are divorced, and one is a widow. All of them have children ranging from 1 to 3. The majority of them have worked in Taiwan more than 10 years, and before working in Taiwan, many of them were migrant domestic workers in the Middle East countries, Singapore and Malaysia. When they are away, when they are working overseas, most of their kids are taken by their parents, especially their own mothers. Next, thanks. So now I move on to the findings. When we talk about the motivation for working overseas, many workers mention that taking care of family is one among the other reasons. And in addition to their own children, many of them emphasize their care responsibility of taking for their parents. And here are the quotes from Lily and Mara, and they both grew up from the peasant families, and they emphasize the reason for them to migrants, and they say they really want to learn more money and help their parents and to improve the life of their parents. Next, please. Thanks. And many workers also mentioned that the pursuit of better life was another reason for their migrations. And what does it mean by better life? It does not only refer to the economic wealth, but include a secure and more stable life. They recall how they grew up with poverty. So in the quotation from Mai and Annie, you can see they mention their family poor, and they don't have much money, and they don't have opportunity to receive more educations. Next, please. And so many interviews talk about of their responsibility to daughter, but at the same time, they also mention lots of contradictory feelings and emotion embedded within their care responsibility. For example, the first one, Yang talked about she doesn't call her mom every day because she was afraid to hear her mother said, "We don't have enough money. Could you remit the extra money to us?" And Annie also mentioned that when she was in Taiwan, she really missed her family. But when she take the holiday back home, she also feel lots of stress because of the economic considerations. Next, please. So the experience of migrant living care workers and their aged parents kind of destabilize the separating identity of caregivers and care recipients, as well as challenge the linear flows of care between these two parties. For example, their aged parents take care of their kids when they are working overseas, and they also, their aged parents also provide the emotional support to migrant workers. Like Ms. Radi emphasized here, she said that I feel reassured because she knows that her father is always there for her. And Care is the collaborative work involve migrant workers, their stay behind aged parents and the other family members. And Rumini mentioned about when she was working in Taiwan, their youngest brothers take care of their mother for the siblings, and what she only can do is she said she remit the money to her youngest brother every month, and the money covers her mother's medical costs and their living expenses, and it's the only things she can do when she was away from home. And Mia and her two sisters, all they three are working in Taiwan, and so when her mother was sick, they decided to hire a local helpers, and they share the helpers' salaries. Next, please. Okay. In order to practice transnational caregiving and maintain the care relationship between themselves and the family back at distance, the workers also pay lots of costs. For example, sometimes the relationship between them and their aged parents are asymmetric. And okay, so like Lina mentions, she said she doesn't talk bad news or bad moods to her mother. She emphasized that she doesn't want her mother to worry her. And Sundari also talked about she really like to go home, but she could not because they don't have money, and she's in charge of the everyday needs of the entire family. So next, thanks. So to conclude my presentations, through the presentation, I try to show that for many Indonesian migrant living care workers, migration is a form to realize their family duty. Their experience blur the dichotomy between the breadwinner and the caregivers, but at the same time, the gender ideals of being a piety daughter shape their vulnerable positions. And the experience of Indonesian migrant living care workers and their aged parents also challenge the traditional idea of care. First, physical proximity is not the only essential condition for providing and receiving care. Second, the flow of care is multi-directional rather than the linear one. Okay, thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Li-Fang, and your cat, of course. Wonderful contribution. Thank you. That was really interesting. It's always nice to see some pets on screen. So we'll move on to our third presentation for today. So I'd like to introduce Majella Kilkey, who's going to talk about immobility in selective and competitive migration regimes, discourses and policies on ageing parents in the UK and Australia. Over to you, Majella.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for that introduction. My presentation today is done collaboratively with my colleague, Loretta Baldassar, from the University of Western Australia. So next slide, please. So despite the dominant emphasis in transnational family research on the possibilities ICTs afford for virtual co-presence, our starting point in this presentation is that proximate care requiring physical co-presence is an enduring and integral element of transnational care relationships. This becomes especially apparent if we take a dynamic perspective on life, family and migration cycles. So there are significant events when proximity may be required, such as births, marriages and deaths. There are family crises when proximity is also needed, and care-intensive points in life course, as well as completion of the family migration journey. So for some households and families, reunification, family reunification, is the ultimate goal in their migration projects. I think we also need to consider cultural expectations around intergenerational solidarity, which are based on proximate care and a preference for familial hands-on care. So there's an important role of mobility regimes in shaping capacity for proximity and its nature. So in other work, we've identified the role of migration regimes in shaping the spatial and temporal configuration of transnational family life, whether it, for example, allows short-term visits, whether it allows circulation within the family network, or whether migration policies ultimately allow long-term unification or reunification. And in this presentation, we're going to explore these issues in relation to one group of migrants. Next slide, please. And that group is a group of older migrants, commonly referred to in the literature as follow the children migrants or zero generation migrants. And these are parents of migrant children who follow or aspire to follow their adult children in migration or engage in back and forth mobility at a relatively old age as a family strategy to exchange both downward and upward intergenerational support. So follow the children migrants are intimately connected to the circulation of care within transnational families. And that's both as older people as caregivers, so for example, providing childcare, or as care receivers, receiving support in later life from their children who've previously migrated. Nedeklu defines this type of these migrants as unexpected. She says they're the unexpected consequence of increasing migration flows of young professionals. This unexpectedness rests on an assumption of migrants, including young professionals, as individuals unfettered by family ties. But as we've heard in a previous presentation and Matt's presentation earlier, the guest worker model of temporary and unaccompanied migration increasingly extends up the skill ladder. Next slide, please. So Loretta and I have been thinking about the mobility and the opportunities for mobility of this group of migrants through the lens of the transnational political economy of care. So we argue that aged parent migration is a neglected element of the transnational political economy of care, defined by Williams as the movements and practices of care labour, care capital, care commitments and political actors, both in terms of global governance and international political mobilisations. So aged parents immigrating to provide childcare for their immigrated children can be seen as an unpaid component of the internationalised care labour force. But aged parent migration is a further dynamic of transnational care commitments. We can see it as a strategy families employ to meet care commitments, both childcare and elder care, when migration has dispersed care networks across borders. And this takes on particular importance in the context of the commoditisation of care under neoliberal governance, where both the provision of childcare and elder care becomes more challenging for families in the context of its marketisation. Next slide, please. So Loretta and I have been thinking about this issue in relation to the UK and Australia. Both countries are traditional countries of immigration. Family-related migration has played an important role previously in both countries, particularly for Australia though, with its emphasis on settlement migration the populator perish mantra. But migration policy in both contexts has been radically transforming since the 2000s. And we've heard a little bit of that already from Matt's presentation earlier. In both countries, this reflects global transitions towards more selective and competition-driven logics designed to maximise national economic competitiveness. Butcher and Guest describe both these countries as neoliberal migration regimes and argue that they are among the most active in selecting and excluding immigrants in the interest of maximising their economic contribution and minimising the risk of their financial dependence on state resources. Next slide, please. So looking firstly at what's been happening in the UK and looking at this very briefly, there was a range of reforms to the family migration route introduced in 2012. And the review of the family migration route in that period was very much framed in terms of welfare dependency. The fact that the assumption that family migrants created a burden on the UK welfare system. There were various changes, but the one I'm going to focus on relates to older migrants, older family migrants, and that's the adult dependent relatives rule. So prior to the changes introduced in 2012 in the UK, parents or grandparents who were 65 years and over could reunite with their family members in the UK if they were wholly, mainly dependent on the UK-based family member for money, had no close relatives in their country to support them, and could be maintained in the UK without recourse to public funds and housed in the accommodation of a UK-based sponsor. In UK or within UK, applications were also allowed. So, for example, someone visiting the UK, visiting family on a visitor visa, could, while on that visa, apply to switch for permanent residence in the UK through the adult dependent relatives rule. The changes in 2012, though, require a demonstration that as a result of age, illness, or disability, they require the long-term personal care to perform everyday tasks, for example, washing, dressing, and cooking, and are unable, even with the practical and financial help of the sponsor, to obtain a required level of care in the country where they are living, because either it is not available and there is no person in that country can reasonably provide it, or it is not affordable. The UK sponsor must also evidence a means to maintain, accommodate and care without recourse to public funds for at least 5 years. And applications can only be made from outside the UK. Now, these changes were introduced in 2012, but as soon as 2013-14, an inquiry into the changes decided or made a judgment that the route had almost been closed. So it was virtually impossible for people in this category, parents, grandparents, age 65 plus, to come to the UK for family reunification purposes. The route had closed. Next slide, please. Moving to Australia, we see a radical revision of the migration programme in the late 1990s. Again, as already alluded to by Matt, we see a shift towards temporary migration visa categories, a focus on skilled migration rather than family reunion. The numbers of temporary long-term arrivals outnumbered permanent settler arrivals for the first time in 1999 and 2000. And we see a competitive points-based system targeted at picking winners. There was a retention of a family reunification route, of which the parent visas are part, representing 20%. But this is overall within an agenda around increasing the temporality of migration. Next slide, please. In 2016, the adult dependents and their reunification became the subject of discussion in the Productivity Commission inquiry. And as it happened in the UK with the 2012 changes, the discussion was very much framed in the welfare dependency of family migrants and older family migrants in particular. So to quote the Commission's findings, they argue that economic outcomes of immigrant parents are typically poor, low integration into the labour market due to their older ages, and in some cases poorer than average English language proficiency. This means lower income and tax than other immigrants. Immigrant parents are at stages of their lives when they make considerable claims on the aged health, care and social security systems, which must be met through taxpayer funds. There was a recognition that older parent migrants might provide social contributions to their families, i.e. in the form of childcare, but the Productivity Commission argued that these mainly benefit the family members themselves and therefore are not of a benefit to wider society. The decision by some skilled migrants to come to Australia is underpinned by the possibility of subsequently obtaining residency for parents. Any moves to restrict parent visas would have some effects on the decisions of their children to migrate. So given all this, the conclusion was that the balance of the costs and benefits, the case for retaining parent visas in their current form is weak. In the end, though, they retained the parent visa scheme, which is contributory visa costing $50,000 US dollars, and a non-contributory visa for which there's a 30-year queue. They also introduced a parenting visit visa, so reflecting the shift towards temporality in the wider Australian migration regime. So this is a 3-year visa, but there's a requirement to be outside Australia for 6 months in every 18 months. Next slide, please. So in terms of concluding, what Loretta and I are thinking about is locating this this form of migration within a transnational ethics of family care frame. So aged parent migration is hotly contested in the restrictive and competitive turn. In the UK, as I've said, there's an almost complete closure of the route. In Australia, permanent settlement remains exclusionary, with the extension of a temporary turn to aged parent migration. Yet there's a clear case for economic justification for aged parent migration, in particular the childcare that they provide for their immigrated children. But it's important to highlight and measure the economic value. While it is important to highlight and measure the economic value, there's also a need, we argue, to transcend the economistic logics driving migration policies. And here, Toronto's ethics of care approach offers potential, since care is valued in itself and not solely as a handmaiden to the economy. But currently, its transnational articulation is developed in respect to the global paid care workforce. And what Loretta and I are arguing is that this requires a transnational ethics of family care articulation at the same time. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Majella. Really interesting presentation. We'll move on to our fourth presentation for the day now. So I'd like to introduce Tanja Ahlin, who's going to talk about gendered inequalities in care and the case of Indian nurses. So over to you, Tanja.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Tanja Ahlin. I'm an anthropologist and a science and technology studies scholar, and I'm a lecturer currently at the University of Amsterdam. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about my research on migrating nurses from Kerala, South India. Now, most of these nurses are Syrian Christian women, and during my research, I found that for them, nursing really was a migration strategy. They became nurses in order to migrate abroad. Now, migration of nurses is grounded in global and local social, economic, and political inequalities. On a global level, these have been described in the literature on global care chains, which describes how mostly women migrate as professional or non-professional carers from the global south and east towards global west and north. On a local level in Kerala, migration of nurses is supported by socioeconomic inequalities as well. Historically, nursing wasn't really seen as a profession that deserved to be paid, but rather as a service to God, which shouldn't be paid otherwise than through donations. So this has resulted to little or no payment for nursing in Kerala and in India more generally, while abroad nurses could earn quite well. Next slide, please. So migration flows and work conditions for nurses are subject to change everywhere. There are global political, social, and economic impacts and events that can change this. So, for example, at the time of Brexit, or just before the actual Brexit happened, you could see a big change in the kind of the nurses who are employed in the United Kingdom, for example. There was a decrease in the nurses coming from the European Economic Area, but there was an increase in the number of nurses coming from India and the Philippines. And in Oman also, these conditions for nurses from Kerala have been changing. They have actually becoming worse during the past several years because of the so-called Omanization, which is the process of including more Omanis into the workforce. And more recently, of course, there has been the COVID pandemic, which has also seen reports of the nurses from Kerala as victims of COVID in Oman. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, I want to talk about actually some different inequalities, and that is more related to how these professional nurses provide care to their parents in India. So these inequalities come to light when we examine how kinship and gender are enacted through things like through specific practices, and how this is also related to remittances and to information and communication technologies. So my argument is international migration, as it is tied to remittances and information and communication technologies, has really changed what it is to be a good daughter among Keralite Syrian Christian families. And this transformation can be observed through elder care practices. Now, I suggest also that the gender roles have changed within the family, but whether this has really challenged the patriarchy, this remains a question. Next slide, please. Thank you. Theoretically, I draw on science and technology studies of care, and particularly on material semiotics. So according to this approach, care is something that is understood, and care is understood as something that is enacted through specific practices. So the same is also with norms. It is not about judging what is good or bad care, but how do people and also technologies and objects work together in pursuit of good care, even though this, of course, might not always be achieved. So what is different here is that care is not only something that happens between people, but that can also include non-human actors such as money and ICTs. Now, in my research, I described transnational care collectives, which include their parents in India, their children abroad, other people like siblings or also non-kin people like friends and neighbors, and information and communication technologies. And in this presentation, I want to look specifically into one aspect of transnational care collectives, which is how are gender and kinship enacted within them. Next slide, please. My field work consisted of field events and field sites. I visited Kerala, which is a South Indian state, and I also visited Oman in person. But I conducted interviews through Skype and phone with people living all around the world. And I describe this notion of field events in one of my publications. But I'll just leave it at this because it's another story. So next slide, please. Before going into some detail on the care practices, I want to give you a very brief description of Syrian Christians, just to have a bit of background. So within India, Syrian Christian women are a dominant minority. And what does this mean? Well, in India, Syrian Christians are a demographic minority, but they are privileged in terms of caste, race, and class. So women, as they belong to upper class, so middle class and upper caste background, they are still at the same time marginalized as women within a rather patriarchal society. And this is despite the fact that in Kerala there is a widespread matrilineal ethos, which is very specific to Kerala. Now, nurses are also a sort of something special within Kerala, because most of them come from the Syrian Christian community. So there are only about 3% Christians within India, yet 30% of nurses in India are Syrian Christians. And this is also related to the pollution taboos, because in Hinduism, nursing is really not seen as a great profession that could be encouraged, because it is seen as polluted. But in Christianity, nursing has a rather positive connotation because it is seen as a service. So it has also gained in respect since the 1960s, because nursing became so important for international migration. So nurses started to migrate first to the US and then also to other countries around the world with the support of the Syrian Christian Church. But there are great differences in the work conditions and migrating processes and residence permits from one country to another. So for Oman, for example, the residence there depends on employment. If you want to live there, you have to have an employment. But once you retire, you have to move out. So the nurses have to move back to India, and they also have no pension. But that is a very different story when it comes to English-speaking countries, where permanent residence is indeed possible. But of course, there are other restrictions in being able to migrate to English-speaking countries. And one of them is that the people who want to migrate there need to pass the English language exam, which is actually highly restrictive. Next slide, please. So what I want to focus a bit more on is how the nurses who migrate abroad take care of their own elderly parents. Now, the global care change literature describes migrants as living behind their family members for whom they should otherwise provide care for. And most of this literature focuses on the children, but then there are also the parents who might be aging and being increasingly in need of care. Among Syrian Christians from Kerala, the duties of daughters are grounded in the patrilineal kinship, which means that the daughters are expected to marry early and take care of their in-laws, while the sons become main elder care providers through financial care and co-residence. But for the nurses from Kerala, this was quite different, because international migration influenced their elder care practices. So what are some of the new duties for daughters who are nurses who migrate abroad? Well, the first care duty is actually that they migrate abroad. The second one would be to send remittances and then to also visit the parents regularly. And then finally, the duty would be to call home regularly. And I'm going to go into each of these duties in some detail. Next slide, please. So first, the international migration, which has become a care practice. So I discovered in my fieldwork that migration is not a subject of individual choice, but it is a family project. The parents are actually heavily involved in the migration project since their daughters are little. They plan for their education, and then they sacrifice and suffer a lot through investing in their daughters' education and migration. They maybe borrow money through bank loans from neighbors, relatives, siblings. Sometimes they sell property and so on. So by contributing to parental suffering, money played an essential part in enacting international migration as a new filial obligation for daughters. And the idiom of suffering emotionally tied the daughters to parental reciprocity. They should repay the suffering, which also had to be fulfilled in specific ways. So first they had to finish their studies, they had to pass the English level, the English language exam, and then preferably migrate to an English-speaking country. And of course, this did not always work very well. So sometimes they were not able to pass the English language exam, and then there was some flexibility in this filial obligation. So, for example, there was flexibility in destination countries. If they didn't manage to pass the English exam, then they could migrate to one of the Middle Eastern countries, for example, where these regulations were quite different. Next slide, please. So once they migrated abroad, the duty for the nurses became to send remittances to their own parents. For the parents of daughters, there was a window of opportunity, that's how they described it to me, to receive money from their daughters, and that was between the time of their graduation or migration to the time of their marriage. Now, the migrating nurses from Kerala actually marry after they're 25 years old, so that's 3 years later than average Christian women in Kerala and 5 years later than all Keralite women, and that is in an attempt to extend this window of opportunity for the parents to receive the money. And just to give you an example, Joy, who was a nurse working in Saudi Arabia, she sent home about 90% of her salary. And with that, the family covered for her parents' and brothers' living expenses. She also paid for her own education loan and for her brother's university fees, for her father's health expenses, and she was also saving money for her own dowry. And this is how, among Syrian Christians, the migrating nursing daughters went from being seen as economic burden to being seen as an asset. But receiving money from daughters was also really fraught with ambivalence because, while adhering to the patriarchal structure of filial reciprocity, the parents could not make open demands on their daughters' remittances or complain if they didn't receive any or enough. Yet they also heavily dependent on their daughters' financial support. And to mitigate this contradiction, the parents appealed to their daughters' emotions through activating the idioms of suffering and sacrifice, and also by accepting rather than expecting financial support from them. So, as sending remittances to their own parents became a new duty for daughters, the way in which this norm was enacted was not really directly confronting the patrilineal system. Next slide, please. What the parents also tried to do was to find a good husband for their daughters. And who was a good husband? That also changed in this situation. A good husband was somebody who would allow the daughter to continue taking care of her own parents as well. So being a nurse abroad, it meant that the daughters had more bargaining power to negotiate with their husbands and also in-laws about their own parents' care in terms of remittances and also in terms of visiting. So this is how Sarah described what she did. She said, Sarah was a nurse in Oman, and she said, I'm giving preference to my parents rather than my in-laws. I'm always telling that to my husband as well, and then he says, but your home is here in my parents' house. And then I say, no, don't think like that, because if my parents didn't educate me, I wouldn't be nothing. I wouldn't get any money. You didn't do anything. You only married me and you gave me 2 children. Okay. But my parents, maybe they don't have enough money now. Maybe they struggle. But because of my parents, I got this job. If they didn't educate me, I wouldn't get the chance to migrate. Nothing came from my husband's side, right? All support came from my parents. And because of them, I got this job and I have to see them first. Next slide, please. So this practice has also led to some redistribution of care workload between husbands and their wives who were nurses abroad. And this was definitely the case for Sarah and her family. So Sarah was traveling, from Oman to India, and then when she was in India, she constantly moved between her parents' house and her husband's house. But while she was moving here and there, her husband took on tasks that were traditionally not expected from husbands. He provided hands-on care, practical care to their 2 daughters, to his own mother, and then also to his parents-in-law. So this was quite a change in family workload. Next slide, please. So finally, the third care practice that I want to mention is frequent calling. In transnational care collectives, calling became a key practice of care because it was something that could be done at a distance, that didn't require physical proximity. So for example, Anthony, who was a nurse in I don't tell my parents, "Mommy, I love you," "Daddy, I love you," but I call them every day. And the frequency of calls depended on the family, but in most cases, the nurses abroad call their parents every day. So from Sarah's quote, you can see that there were differences in expectations between children abroad, depending on their gender. Daughters were expected to call home more frequently than sons. And another difference was also that the parents shared much more related to health problems with the daughters than they did with sons. So the final slide, please. So the transformations of the daughter-parents relationship, whereby daughters become primary carers for their own parents through financial, practical, and emotional care, are significant for the patriarchal Syrian Christian families in which just a generation ago, married women had to leave their natal families and focus on their ties with their in-laws. As such, the new duties of good daughters conflicted with the Syrian Christian patriarchy and made them replete with ambivalence. But the Carolite Syrian Christian women nurses have been the frontrunners in opening up their engagement in transnational labor markets and transforming filial duties of elder care. Yet it remains unclear if the social and spatial organization of nursing work that encourages women's transnational mobility could represent a serious threat to the patriarchal order. How, if at all, the described transformations of duties could impact the status of women nurses in Kerala beyond their families is thus an issue that we still have to explore. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanja, for that really fascinating presentation. We'll move straight on to our final presentation, which is my own. So I will introduce myself now. So I'll get straight on. So my research is on transnational family care for older British migrants who are living in Spain. So next slide, please. So just to set the scene, there are approximately 168,000 British pensioners legally resident in Spain, but we do know that many more live there. So this 168,000 doesn't include those who are not of pension age, and also those who are not legally resident. So for example, those who move back and forth between the UK and Spain, or who retain British residency but live in Spain for all or most of the year. So most British retirees in Spain live a transnational life, and that involves strong ongoing connections to the UK, and that's through family ties in the UK, friends, British friends in Spain, and through ongoing identity. So that identity can be seen through social networks and social activities in Spain. So for example, most people I've interviewed in Spain are a member of at least one British-run social club in Spain. Next slide, please. So most research to date has explored the reasons for moving and the experiences of retirees who are primarily in the third age of life. So my research has instead focused on ageing and it's explored what happens when British people reach the fourth age and need care and additional support in Spain. Some of the existing research does suggest that migrants return home in old age. And for many, this is actually part of the retirement plan. It was something they were always intending to do once they reached that point where they needed care. Others, however, do prefer to stay in Spain, but are actually often surprised that the care system in Spain is somewhat different to in the UK. So in Spain, care is underpinned by the family, so state care provision is very minimal. The Ley de Dependencia law, or the dependency law, introduced some 15 years ago in Spain, did try to extend care provision, but it was largely repealed as a result of the economic crisis at the time. Now we have Brexit that is impacting on British retirees in Spain, and I'll say a little bit more about Brexit towards the end. Next slide, please. So my paper is focused on transnational care, particularly the idea of transnational families. And this has largely been defined as families that live some or most of the time separated from each other, yet hold together a sense of collective welfare or unity across national borders. So existing research has suggested that transnational families can continue to provide care. However, there are debates around the extent and type of care that can be provided across borders. And this is where my paper really slots into these ongoing debates. Next slide, please. So my research of two key questions that I'm going to address today. So first, what are the strategies used by older British migrants to access family-based care in Spain? And to what extent are these care strategies transnational? Next slide, please. So just very, very briefly, my data collection involved interviews with 34 older British migrants in February 2019, all of whom lived in the Costa del Sol. Their average age was around 77 years, and they'd spent an average time in Spain of about 18 years, so most had lived there for a substantial amount of time. And the people I interviewed were a mix of people who either received informal or unpaid or paid for care, or who provided informal care to normally a spouse. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just present three types of what I'm calling transnational care strategies, and I'll go through each of these in turn. So next slide, please. So first of all, transnational caregiving. So this was the first and most common type of transnational care, which is basically care across borders with children living in the UK or sometimes elsewhere. So for example, this might be children in Australia, and they were providing care to their elderly parents in Spain. This care was normally through visits and virtual communication. Such care tended to be mostly emotional and sometimes financial, and actually it did go in both directions, particularly when the parents in Spain were a little bit younger or didn't have substantial care needs, involved grandchildren, for example. So this included regular calls, messages, Skype, and visits as well, like sometimes short-term visits, but also extended visits, particularly during times of crisis. Contact tended to be ongoing, but did increase as well during times of crisis. So crisis being, for example, for the elderly parents in Spain, normally a health crisis, or if one of the parents died, the amount and the frequency of contact and visits increased. Overall, I found that transnational caregiving was quite limited and quite short term. For example, there was a lady who I interviewed who was an informal carer for her husband in Spain, but she had to go into hospital. Her son came over to care for her husband while she was in hospital, but found that actually she was quite surprised at how quickly she was released from hospital and still needed quite a lot of care. So her son ended up staying in Spain for as long as he possibly could and cared for both herself and her husband. Her son then had to return to the UK for work, at which point he helped them to arrange for some paid care to help them both at home. This is a really common scenario, with family visiting during times of crisis, but then having to return to the UK or elsewhere for work or other family commitments, meaning that visits to Spain were often short and paid for care was needed and was there as a backup. And visits, of course, were also subsidised with virtual communication and often that financial support. Next slide, please. Second, we have joiners, or actually what Majella spoke about in terms of the follow their children migrants or aged parent migration would fit quite nicely as well. So joiners involved British people, often themselves retired, moving their elderly parents from the UK to Spain so that they could provide care for them. So this is a retiree in Spain, elderly parent in the UK who needs care. And it was quite common and usually occurred when there was no other family support systems in the UK. It was normally a daughter. In fact, in every case, it was a daughter moving their parents to Spain, either parents, both parents, or often one parent following the death of the other parent. In a small number of cases, this was quite successful and the parents enjoyed living in Spain. They did make friends, they had a decent quality of life, but actually in the vast majority of cases, it didn't go so well, and the parents moved to Spain, but they didn't like living in Spain, and they had a very limited quality of life. In many cases, the daughter struggled to care for them, either at home or with buying in some additional paid for care as well. And this was quite a sort of typical scenario. So, for example, the case on the slide here is a very typical example where my interviewee moved to Spain. She was 74 at the time of interview, but had lived in Spain for many years, and she moved when she was in 1974. So basically, what she did in 2016, she moved her elderly, now 95-year-old mother to Spain because her mother was in the UK and had no family care there. So what ended up happening was she was caring for her at home initially, but her care needs increased significantly, and she ended up moving her mother into a Spanish residential care home. Her mother really didn't like the care home, and actually now she feels very stuck in Spain because her care needs have increased so much that she's no longer able to return to the UK. I mean, the quote sort of sums it up really. I mean, they said at the time we thought it was a good idea. She wasn't 100% happy at the time, but we just carried on, and actually now making the move back is too difficult. Next slide, please. The final group are what I'm calling returners, so those who return to be close to family in the UK when they needed care. This was particularly common when a partner died. So, for example, the first quote there was from someone who was pre-planning a return, who said if anything happened, she was caring for her husband in Spain. She said if anything happened to her husband, she'd go back and live with her daughter in the UK. So in that respect, her return was pre-planned. Others were not pre-planned in that a partner died and they felt at that point they wanted to return, but it wasn't necessarily part of the plan. Also, return happened frequently when friends in Spain, leaving a much more limited support network there. Second quote, yes, last few years I've had an inkling to go back. I think it's because a lot of our friends have gone back, or the other cases where friends, as people age, obviously their friends die, so their support networks in Spain become much more limited, and they return most commonly to be close to family in the UK. There was also the scenario of retirees returning either through regular or extended visits, or even permanently to care. I mentioned returning to care for grandchildren, but also returning to care for elderly parents back in the UK. So one of my interviews spoke about having to go to see her mother in the UK numerous times a year, and she spent quite a lot of time there caring for her mother in the UK. Next slide, please. So overall, I found that transnational family care is really most successful when it comes to emotional or financial support, but also during times of crisis. But most importantly, it's where there's an end point to that crisis. Actually, proximity is so important when it comes to the kind of long-term care. And transnational care often starts with a combination of visits and virtual support. But then when care needs progress and are no longer being met, it often results in an outward or return migration. However, just to a few final points really, I suppose just to recognise that migration needs to be considered within a wider social, economic, political context. So, for example, migrating to receive care or return for care is quite expensive and might not be an option for some. And actually what can happen is it can lead to the sort of economic financial situation can lead to some very vulnerable elderly British people being stuck in Spain when they can't afford to return to the UK. Whilst the British welfare state is responsible for the healthcare of British pensioners in Spain, they're not responsible for their social care. So the Spanish welfare system is very different from the UK. And actually many retired migrants don't plan ahead in relation to their potential care needs. Just finally, in relation to Brexit, Brexit has and will likely lead to some changes in the British retirement community in Spain. Whilst those who became resident by the end of 2020 will have their rights protected under the withdrawal agreement, those who moved from January this year will have more limited rights. Also, the 90-day rule will restrict transnational care, with family being unable to spend significant amounts of time during times of crisis, particularly. So after 90 days, they'd have to return for another 90 days, which will really limit, especially if a crisis occurs. Equally, I suppose, just to recognise as well, the COVID crisis is likely also to transform retirement migration and transnational care moving forward. Thank you. Okay, so that finalises our presentations for today. So we've had our 5 presentations. What I'd like to do now is just introduce our discussant, so Reiko Ogawa, who is going to spend 10 minutes just summarising and posing some questions for each of us. So over to you, Reiko.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed all the presentations. It has been fascinating experience. Slide please. And next slide please. I think all of the presentations identified clearly who moves and why, where care becomes, including its crisis, central to the motives and the challenges of transnational family life. Sociologists like Beck and Bauman has been discussing the concept of individualization, that social change in late modernity will weaken the family norms and individuals will have more freedom to choose their lives. Faced by liquid modernity in Bauman's sense and prevailing and persistent global inequalities, migration has become a strategy for global householding to sustain their livings and well-beings. The presentation reaffirms that migration is a family project and care is a driving force to facilitate mobility. Family and familial obligations, cultural and social norms still matters, and care serves as a magnet that brings together the families that are separated across borders. All the presentations demonstrated that transnational care flows are multidimensional. It's in intergenerational care based on reciprocity, and multidimensional that encompasses both paid and unpaid care, care receiver and caregiver, and take multiple forms, including physical, emotional, moral, through internet, and financial, that contributes to our understanding of changing forms of care in the transnational context. Money and love is not dichotomous, but a manifestation of varieties of social relationships embedded within the dynamics of transnational care. However, transnational care has been underpinned by mobility and immobility through various factors. I think Matt, Li-Fang, Majella, and Tanya's presentation talked about the policies in the receiving states. It is often the case that temporary labor migration programs or other migration programs neither allow family reunion, as the state do not want them to settle, nor allow free mobility of migrants during the contract period. So the physical care needs will be suspended or postponed. The socio-economic status of migrants also matters, as in the Majella's presentation. Health condition of the parents also matters, as in Kelly's presentation. Their ability to use modern devices such as internet in Tanya's presentation also matters, as well as language proficiency in the destination countries and social skills not to be isolated and confined within the sphere of the family. The presentation reminds me of the relationship between mobility and social protection. Numerous migration literature points to the vulnerability of migrants who are marginalized in the destination countries. Under the pandemic, where mobility has been restricted, one might need to rethink about the relationship between mobility and social protection. Does mobility open up more choices and increase social protection of migrant families if there is a safe pathways? I think some of the presentations implied the lack of social security in the sending countries that drives them to migrate. Or do migrants become more vulnerable when they are stuck due to the closure of the borders? And in what way mobility can facilitate social protection? Next slide, please. So I move on to the question to each presentations. For Matt, I think you try to connect migration care and development through the temporary labour migration program in Australia. So it's like killing two birds or three birds with one stone. And I would like to know more about the contradictions and contestations between the idea and ideal of migration and development in the Pacific, and to have migrants as labourers. And in what way can a demand-driven program serve the developmental goals in the Pacific? And what are the intakes of the Pacific Islanders through the experiences of migration, aside from monetary gain? I think you hinted a bit at the end, like reassemble care or to invest on community care services, but I would be happy if you can elaborate a bit more. For Li-Fan, your presentation clearly shows that Indonesian women are fulfilling the role of a good daughter through the act of filial piety, but torn between their emotions to physically be with their families and her obligation for their economic well-being. And I was wondering about the care responsibilities that they carry. What are the boundaries of the care responsibility for Indonesian migrant care workers? Like, are they responsible just for the natal family, the in-laws, the uncles and aunts, nieces and nephews? So are there any boundaries of their responsibility to care? And how do they divide their care responsibility as daughters, daughters-in-law, but at the same time, mothers and wives? And for Majella, I think you successfully articulated how UK and Australia has been facing towards the migrants and their parents who are aging. For migrant families, to bring the parents in an extent is like an extended social security, as it will be great to have parents who speak the language and teach the grandchildren the routes, the migration trajectories, and their own routes. It can be seen as an outsourcing of care to the migrant parents, and the host society is facilitating the privatization and individualization of care, making care as a family responsibility. In UK, you mentioned that the migrant parents should not turn to public funding for at least 5 years. And I was wondering about the social rights of the migrants, like access to medical care and affordability of it, and the process of death and dying as the next stage. Well, you mentioned that the route has been closed, but for Australia, as well as for UK, you may have migrants who are also aging, but maybe stratified according to the residential status or the citizenship. So I was wondering about how the social rights has been framed and discussed in those two countries regarding those aging parents. And of course, if you have the old age migrants, in what way the process of death and dying is understood by the migrant families, because these are also like moral, ethical, as well as cultural issues. So, and of course, migrants are not a heterogeneous community, but I was wondering if you have any idea about this. Next slide, please. For Tanja, it was interesting to see how perceptions of daughters have shifted from being an economic burden to an asset to the parents' discourse, to reiterate their sacrifice, spending for their daughters' education and expecting them to pay back the debt through migration. You have demonstrated that the new duty for daughters does not threaten patriarchy, but I wonder, what is the space for a mobile daughter-in-law? You mentioned about it, but what are the expectations of their parents-in-law to have daughters-in-law as a migrant nurse? And isn't there more conflicting terrains with the in-laws, especially leaving the husband behind? How do the nurses negotiate between the financial gain and responsibility to care for her in-laws? And for Kelly, My question is about the social relationships and vulnerability of those retirees. You mentioned about the reproduction of Britishness, and since the British population, the retirement population in Spain seems to be quite sizable, the retirees might be able to live within their own community, creating like a British enclave. But I was wondering about what is the relationship with the local community. For example, are they willing to learn Spanish or how to live in Spain? And is there any cultural friction with the local community, for example, having prejudice and discrimination? And what are the vulnerabilities and risks of the retirees aside from physical deterioration and health conditions? Does the integration with the local community help to mitigate the vulnerability? So that's it. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you for that really useful summary and for the questions as well. What I will do now is return to each of the presenters in turn and give them an opportunity to respond to those questions. So we'll start with Matt. So Matt, did you want to respond?
Thanks for the questions, Reiko. I'll try and keep my responses very brief. In terms of demand-driven migration and how that interfaces with development promise of the Pacific, I think it doesn't actually offer much promise for development at all. And particularly the way that Australia set the contours of its migration regime seems to be very much in keeping with the kind of migration regimes we see in West Asia, Taiwan and Hong Kong, in terms of the restrictiveness of migration and the limitations imposed on workers. But as far as I'm aware, those other labour migration schemes don't take up the pretense of it being a development programme. And the fact that Australia has labelled it as such, I think, is quite a cynical interpretation of the potential for remittances to actually resolve development issues for the Pacific. And certainly on the basis of previous migration schemes, such as seasonal migration from the Pacific to Australia, there seems to be insufficient evidence to suggest that development outcomes have been achieved through those demand-driven programs. I think large part of that is to do with the fact that workers are effectively bonded to a single employer and are unfree in the sense that their employment relationship barely reflects a capitalist system of production at that point. And also that there's a lot of intermediaries and labour brokers who routinely exploit migrant workers and take advantage of asymmetries in information to actually take a significant chunk of their income while they're still in Australia before that residual amount of income gets sent back to the Pacific. So there's a very tenuous argument, I think, even on the financial aspects of the developmental promise, and that's even before bringing into the care considerations, which have been completely absent in Australian policymaking. And so what I've been trying to do through this research is signal the need for that. With regards to the experience of Pacific Islanders, the drive to participate in these schemes comes from the fact that there are so few local employment opportunities, that the cash economy itself across these Pacific Islands is tiny in comparison to the subsistence economy, which is largely agricultural. So there is a real absence of jobs to begin with. But I think the problem here is that when, even if I'm relatively successful, the money which returns to the Pacific tends to be consumed very quickly for cultural reasons, which can also be fractious to family relationships. But more so, the process of being in Australia, I think, tends to catalyse a change in values and aspirations amongst those migrants, where again, those same asymmetries in information mean that migrants often don't understand that Australia's migration regime offers them no pathway to permanent residency. And so there's often, on behalf of the migrant worker, an intention to find a way to become resident in Australia without recognising perhaps that those regimes are categorically not going to allow that to happen. So I think in part of that value change, you often see then the breakdown in relationships and changing aspirations, and return migrants no longer necessarily engaging with their families and social networks in the same way they did previously. So it's quite detrimental in that sense too. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. Well, I'll move on to Li-Fang. Did you want to have an opportunity to respond?
Okay, sure. So Reiko, thank you for the comments and questions. So I think the experience of Indonesian living care workers in Taiwan kind of challenge the ideal of family, and how they define family is very different from to the nuclear family based on the Western culture. And I think it's because I think it's influenced by their culture and also by their living arrangement in, especially in rural Java. So when they refer to the concept of family, of course, they refer to their parents, not only their own parents, but also parents-in-law. Sometimes depends on their relationship with themselves and their parents-in-law, and also not only include their own children, but also refer to their siblings and their uncles, aunties, and even sometimes they include the other the other friends or neighbors in the same village. So I think how they define family is very different from the Western ideal, and most of them, of course, most of them have their children as their priority. But it's my cat again. But since many of their children stay behind, live with their own parents, so how they arrange, so they need to collaborate with their parents and to provide the care arrangement to their children. So it's not only about the remittance, but also about the emotional part. But for their husbands, usually they don't use the term responsibility to describe their relationship with their husband, and they I think based on my interviews, most of them pay more attention to most of them focus on their responsibility as mother and as piety daughters. I think maybe it's also because the intimate relationship between themselves and their husband are really unstable because the long distance, and most of them are cheated by their husband in their home countries. So okay, I think I'll end my response here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to Majella. Majella, did you want to respond?
Yeah, thank you so much, Reiko, for all those wonderful comments. You've certainly given me a lot of food for thought in those. I'll reply just to one of your key questions, which was about the ways in which follow the children migrants are recognised or not. And I have to say that there's a real lack of recognition of the contribution that they play or potentially play in both countries. And I think that reflects the general invisibilization and lack of recognition to family-based care, whatever type of care that is. So it fits with the very kind of neoliberal approach to care that we see more generally in Australian and UK societies. In the UK, this has resulted in the route being, more or less blocked. The numbers are now tiny each year of visas granted for adult dependent relatives. In Australia, I think is really interesting, and this fits really nicely with Matt's presentation, that even aged parents have become incorporated within this guest worker model of migration, where they're, not officially, but effectively that's what's happening. They're coming for months at a time to provide the childcare, look after the grandchildren, because in Australia it's so expensive to purchase that in the market, and there's so little state support. But then they're expected to go back home and wait at home for a period of time until they're entitled to apply again to come back. So they're trapped in this permanent temporariness that we see occurring throughout the Australian labour market for migrants. So I'll leave it at that, given time constraints.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Majella. Tanja, do you want to respond?
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. And I think they touch on a really important point. So the question for me was about the expectations of the in-laws regarding the daughters-in-law. So indeed, the female nurses are not supposed to be only good daughters, but they're also supposed to be good daughters-in-law. So they do, in that care, receive extra care work, let's say. There was, in the whole of my field work, there was only one story that I heard about a woman who resigned as a nurse from her job in Oman to return back to Kerala to take care of her parents, or her father-in-law, for 8 months while he was dying. But that was a sort of almost a legend that happened sometime, that somebody knew a while ago. But the nurses that I spoke to, they said, well, if somebody gets sick, you still have to provide money, right, to pay for the healthcare for that. So instead of returning home for their own family members or for their parents-in-law, instead of doing that, they decided usually to stay abroad and to provide money for healthcare. Right. The family that I talked about in my presentation, Sarah and her husband, that was maybe not a very typical family in terms of the fact that the husband returned back home and provided all this care to other family members. It was, more often what happened was that the husband also migrated with the wife abroad. And the hope there was that he would also find an employment. So what happened, on the other hand, was often that they were very disappointed. The husband struggled with finding employment, and if they did, they found one that was not paid as much as their wife's job. And that, of course, led to tensions within the couple, and also, some also had very tragic consequences even. Marie Perco writes a bit about that as well. And yet, so the husbands often ended up being childcare providers, even abroad, for the couple's family. And yet, to be a nurse who has migrated abroad, and especially in an English-speaking country where they could get permanent residency and also this opportunity to receive a pension after they retire, this was always a gain for every family. And that's why also the value of nurses who had migrated abroad successfully on the marriage market was quite high, because of this possibility also for other family members to join them later on. So even though they had to accept that they will not receive all of the remittances, but only a part of it, the in-laws were usually quite happy if there was a nurse who was abroad, especially in an English-speaking country. I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tanja. And for me to respond, I think I was just going to pick up on your questions around integration. So I guess what I would say is that there is a fairly limited amount of integration between British retirees in Spain and the kind of local community. So most British people speak limited, or in some cases no, Spanish. Most of their social networks, their friendships, their support networks are largely within the British community. Most people have what they would call as sort of Spanish friends, neighbours or acquaintances, but their most substantial connections are with other British people. And as I say, they do retain those strong ties across borders as well, with family back in the UK. And of course, this does limit care and integration. And actually, it's at the point where people maybe need that care or additional support that suddenly they struggle. So, accessing social services, for example, is very difficult if you don't speak Spanish, because social workers, carers don't tend to speak English, so there can be a real language barrier there, so it actually restricts access to the care systems that do exist. So older British people in Spain tend to be more dependent as they age on the kind of British community. So that includes sort of British friends, British neighbours, British charities, sort of NGOs. So there's a whole host of voluntary organisations, Age Concern España, Aged Care Association, British Benevolent Fund, for example. All these organisations are really active in Spain, and they're particularly active as people age and need care, and they will help people organise care, they'll provide mobility equipment, they'll take people to hospital, they'll translate at hospitals. So they're very dependent on those as they age. And also there's a growing amount of sort of paid for private care services that are set up by, staffed by British or English speaking people. And so through my interviews, I found that most people actually preferred those services. So yeah, there's a growing actually British care community, British care system in Spain, and to some extent, I suppose that is further limiting integration with the local community. And you sort of asked a bit about discrimination and sort of prejudice and discrimination. And actually, most people despite that, they do have a good relationship with the sort of Spanish local communities. I mean, there's a few people spoke about some kind of conflicts around Brexit, of course, particularly because there are still quite a lot of British people in Spain who would have or did vote for Brexit. So you also get this conflict between the British and Spanish communities, and actually within the British community as well, because you've got those who voted for or against Brexit, and actually that's in itself creating some conflict within the community as opposed to across communities. But yeah, I'll stop there. As I say, I'm conscious of time. So I suppose just to sum up then, thank you to everybody for absolutely fascinating presentations. There's some absolutely brilliant connections across our presentations as well. And Reiko, for your really insightful summary and questions, I think has made all of us think a little bit more about our work and sort of potential areas for further investigation. I guess just to finish up, did anyone, Reiko or anyone, did you have any final comments or anything you wanted to contribute before we finish? Okay, brilliant. In that case, thank you everybody. Thank you so much. And it was a really, really great couple of hours. I'll see you all soon.